For this assignment, I wanted to focus on boarding schools in Alaska. There is quite a bit that we could discuss on the topic of Alaska Native education, so for this assignment, I tried to focus on specifically the topic of boarding schools and to dive into one of our readings. So we are going to start during the time after Sheldon Jackson has divided Alaska into different regions, which he contracted out to different religious groups, and he is focusing on the mandatory education of the Alaska Natives. First, a brief history of boarding schools in Alaska. They became prominent during the late 1800s, and mandatory attendance at some sort would continue through the 1970s. The goal of the boarding schools was to assimilate the native children into the dominant culture by Christianizing them and civilizing them. When the U.S. government became invested in this, they found that it was cheaper to collect the children into a centralized location instead of trying to support a bunch of schools in rural areas. Boarding schools and boarding homes were created and would be run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, private churches, and the Alaska state government. Children would be sent to these schools around Alaska and also to the lower 48. The reading 30 years later looks at the long-term effects of boarding schools on Alaska Natives and their communities. For this study, the authors interviewed 62 Alaska Native adults. Each interviewee attended a boarding school or home, either inside or outside of Alaska, between the time periods of 1940 to 1980. Those interviewed were from all over Alaska, and they asked a series of open-ended questions in order to gain an understanding of their personal experience at the boarding school and how it has impacted them. The first question was whether attending the boarding school was a choice or if they were required. Some remembered having to apply and being accepted or rejected. One person interviewed could have stayed at a local high school, but they wanted to attend one of the boarding schools with a better reputation, so he applied. Others interviewed stated that they did not have an option or a choice as to what school they attended. They were just told, you have to go and this is where you're going. This seemed to be most common for those who lived in rural areas where there were no local schools. In areas with no primary schools, or what we call elementary schools today, required boarding for students as young as 5 years old, which just seems so young to me. Next, they asked about the overall school experience. This was highly varied and largely depended on which school was attended. 70% of those who went to Mount Edgecumbe, Copper Valley, Chippewa, and St. Mary's felt that they had an overall positive experience, whereas those who attended Wrangell, Nome Belt, or one of the boarding homes, they tend to report more negative experiences. There was also a varied level of the quality of education. St. Mary's and Copper Valley reported the most challenging curriculum with high expectations. They reported being encouraged to attend college, and they felt more prepared for post-secondary academics. To contrast, Nome Belts was stated to have a poor quality of education with low expectations for the students. One interviewee reported having to take remedial coursework in college as they were not prepared academically. Mount Edgecumbe was the most attended school among those interviewed. It had a reputation for being a good school and was the harder one to get into as there were a lot of people who applied to attend there. However, despite this popularity, the school had mixed reviews from those who attended. The experiences seemed to vary largely on whether the student was considered a high or low achiever. If the student did well, they were given more challenging classes and they were treated better, while those who struggled were not challenged and were given lower expectations and reported more negative experiences. There were very few or no Native educators at the boarding schools. Native language, history, and culture were also not included in the curriculum at the schools. Those who attended during the later decades, though, in the 70s and 80s, had more cultural experiences such as Native arts or dance that they practiced. However, some schools with that were more severe in their practices to teach English would use physical punishment to discourage the speaking of the students' native languages. Those interviewed shared positive and negative experiences. Positive experiences including becoming more self-sufficient and independent, participating in extracurricular activities that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to experience, building friendships, and gaining access to the wider world. Negative experiences including physical and sexual abuse, feeling like they were living in a jail, alcohol and drug use, and also suicide, or I guess witnessing suicide, or maybe suicide attempts. The negative experiences from the boarding schools have been attributed to lasting trauma through PTSD and alcohol abuse. Upon returning home, people describe difficulties reintegrating with their own family and also with their community. Being absent for years of their youth gave them a sense of loss of culture when they were not taught and could not practice their traditions and way of life, such as subsistence practices. PSOS report that being away from their family and community has negatively impacted parenting skills, as their children were raised by outsiders and not parental figures. Finally, the years of suppression of the native language and lack of educational opportunities to build their language skills has created a massive loss of language, which has further contributed to the loss of identity. Personal connection that I made to this was that these events occurred in recent history. I feel like when I studied Native American history living in the lower 48 when I was a kid, it seemed like it was something that happened hundreds of years ago. However, the mandatory boarding schools were happening through the 60s. My parents were born in the mid-1950s and they are still alive today. So these are experiences that people who they're still living, and they are actively sharing the experiences that they lived with their children, and the repercussions from these events are present day struggles. Additional questions that I had were kind of regarding just the few remaining boarding schools that are still in use today. I was curious about just kind of the thought on, the students attending those schools, if that was still encouraged or discouraged now. What are the current practices like at those schools, such as curriculum? How are things different? Are they allowed to learn their native languages? It's just, I just want to know how things are there now. And this concludes my presentation. Thank you.